Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1839 when Nathaniel Rhodes first arrived in Charleston. The bustling port city was at its peak, with ships constantly arriving from Europe and the Caribbean, bringing with them goods, people, and sometimes secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The cobblestone streets of the historic district echoed with the sounds of commerce and society, masking the whispers that ran beneath the surface of polite conversation. Nathaniel, a man of 32 years, had come from Boston with impeccable credentials and letters of introduction to some of Charleston's most prominent families. His manner was reserved but pleasant, his clothes finely tailored without being ostentatious. He had purchased a modest but respectable home on Trad Street, just 2 blocks from the harbor. According to the property records filed with the Charleston County Clerk, he paid in full, in cash. No mortgage was ever recorded. What drew attention, though discreetly at first, was that Nathaniel Rhodes arrived alone. No wife, no children, no household staff accompanied him on his journey south. In a society where one's position was partially determined by one's household, this solitude was unusual. More unusual still was his stated occupation. He had come to research and document the shipping records of Charleston from 1790 to 1820. A scholarly pursuit that raised eyebrows among the mercantile class. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, Nathaniel had secured permission to access the harbour master's archives. The curator of these records, a Mr. William Pinckney, noted in his personal journal that Rhodes spent hours meticulously examining manifests, particularly those from ships arriving from West Africa and the West Indies. His diligence would be admirable, Pinckney wrote, were it not for the unsettling intensity with which he scrutinizes certain entries, sometimes returning to the same document day after day. It was in the early days of June when Nathaniel Rhodes first encountered Clara Beaumont at a small literary gathering hosted by the Middleton family. Clara, 26 years old and unmarried, was something of an anomaly in Charleston society. The daughter of a respected physician, she had been educated in Philadelphia and had returned with ideas and interests that marked her as different. Her father indulged her intellectual pursuits, perhaps out of guilt, following her mother's death during a cholera outbreak 12 years prior. The gathering at the Middleton home was recorded in several social diaries of the time. Mrs. Eleanor Ravenel noted that Rhodes and Miss Beaumont spent an unseemly amount of time in conversation about historical matters. Another attendee, Judge Harrison Grimble, observed that their discussion seemed to grow quite intense at one point, with Miss Beaumont appearing visibly disturbed before excusing herself from the gathering entirely. What was discussed between them that evening would later become the subject of much speculation. According to the household staff at the Beaumont residence, Clara returned home in a state of agitation, immediately requesting that her father's medical journals from the years 1815 through 1820 be brought to her room. She remained sequestered with these volumes until dawn. The summer heat descended upon Charleston like a smothering blanket. The wealthy who could afford to do so retreated to summer homes in Aiken or the mountains of North Carolina. Those who remained moved through the humid days with a languid resignation. Nathaniel Rhodes, however, only intensified his research. He was granted access to the records of St. Philip's Church, one of the oldest in Charleston. The parish secretary noted that Rhodes had a particular interest in the burial records from a section of the churchyard that had been reserved for strangers to the city. Clara Beaumont began making regular visits to the Charleston Library Society. The librarian, Miss Sarah Frost, maintained a careful log of materials requested by patrons. Clara's requests took a decidedly macabre turn, medical texts on tropical diseases, slave ship conditions, and curiously, several volumes on Charleston's history of quarantine procedures during yellow fever outbreaks. In mid-July, an unusual occurrence was noted in the Charleston Mercury newspaper. A brief item, tucked between reports of cotton prices and shipping schedules, mentioned that someone had attempted to access the sealed records from the 1822 yellow fever epidemic. The article speculated that this was likely the work of medical students from the college, but emphasized that these particular records had been sealed by order of the governor at that time. On July 23rd, Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont were seen walking together along the Battery. This morning promenade was witnessed by at least 3 residents who later provided statements. Mrs. Catherine Huger recalled that the pair appeared to be in serious discussion, with Rhodes occasionally consulting what appeared to be notes. Clara seemed pale, even accounting for the parasol she carried to shield herself from the sun. At one point, they stopped walking altogether, and Clara appeared to sway slightly, as though overcome by the heat or by some disturbing revelation. The following day, Clara Beaumont did not appear at the weekly gathering of the Charleston Ladies' Botanical Interest Group, of which she was a founding member. Her absence was noted particularly because she was scheduled to present findings on medicinal uses of native plants. A servant was dispatched to the Beaumont home to inquire after her health, only to be told by the housekeeper that Miss Beaumont was not receiving visitors due to a nervous complaint. Dr. Beaumont was increasingly concerned about his daughter's state of mind. According to his private correspondence with a colleague in Philadelphia, Clara had become obsessed with a historical matter that she refused to fully explain. He described finding her one night in his study, surrounded by his medical journals, making notes about patients who had died under unusual circumstances during the 1822 epidemic. "She seems convinced," he wrote, "that there is a pattern to these deaths that has been deliberately obscured." August brought storms to the Carolina coast. The streets of Charleston flooded repeatedly, and the air hung heavy with moisture and the scent of decay. Nathaniel Rhodes expanded his research to include the records of the South Carolina Medical Society. His request to review the minutes of meetings from 1821 through 1823 was initially denied, as these were restricted to members of the medical profession. However, a letter of introduction from Dr. Beaumont eventually secured him access, a fact that raised eyebrows among the Society's leadership. On August 12th, an incident occurred that was recorded in the daily log of the Charleston Watch. Shortly after midnight, a watchman on patrol near the old quarantine hospital on Sullivan's Island reported seeing lights moving within the abandoned building. When he approached to investigate, he found the door ajar but no one inside. What he did discover, according to his report, were fresh footprints in the dust and what appeared to be recently disturbed papers in what had once been the hospital's administrative office. The watchman secured the building and made note of the intrusion, but no formal investigation was launched. 3 days later, Dr. Beaumont sent for Dr. James Moultrie, a colleague and friend, to examine Clara. Dr. Moultrie's notes from this consultation, discovered decades later among his papers, described Clara as showing signs of acute nervous exhaustion. More troubling, she exhibited fixed ideas of a conspiratorial nature and spoke repeatedly about what was brought on the harmony and those who were never accounted for. Dr. Moultrie recommended rest, seclusion, and the administration of laudanum to calm her agitated state. As August drew to a close, Nathaniel Rhodes made an unexpected request to the city authorities. He applied for permission to exhume a grave in the stranger section of St. Philip's churchyard. The request, preserved in municipal records, cited historical research of significant public interest, but provided no specific details. The request was denied by the church vestry, who expressed their shock at such an unusual and disturbing proposal. Clara Beaumont's condition continued to deteriorate. The household staff reported hearing her pacing in her room at night, sometimes speaking in urgent whispers as though conversing with an unseen companion. Dr. Beaumont finally made the difficult decision to send his daughter to the care of relatives in Philadelphia. Arrangements were made for her to travel north on the packet ship Carolina, scheduled to depart on September 7th. The evening before Clara's planned departure, Nathaniel Rhodes appeared at the Beaumont residence on Meeting Street. The butler, who admitted him later, stated that Rhodes seemed unusually agitated, insisting that he needed to speak with Miss Beaumont on a matter of grave importance. Dr. Beaumont reluctantly allowed the meeting but insisted on being present. According to the butler, who admittedly listened at the door, Rhodes urged Clara to reconsider her departure, saying, "We are close to the truth. The connections are unmistakable." Dr. Beaumont eventually asked Rhodes to leave, but not before Rhodes pressed a small leather notebook into Clara's hands, whispering something that the butler could not hear. After Rhodes departed, Clara locked herself in her room with the notebook and refused to speak even to her father. The morning of September 7th dawned grey and threatening. A storm was approaching from the southeast, and the harbour pilot advised delaying the Carolina's departure until the weather cleared. Clara Beaumont never arrived at the dock. When servants were sent to her room to collect her trunks, they found the door locked. After repeated knocking went unanswered, Dr. Beaumont ordered the door forced open. Clara's room was empty. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the wind. On her desk lay Rhodes' notebook, open to a page filled with what appeared to be a list of names, dates, and cryptic annotations. Next to it was a note in Clara's handwriting. "Father, I must know the truth about what happened on Sullivan's Island. Forgive me." Dr. Beaumont immediately contacted the City Watch, and a search was organized. Messengers were sent to Nathaniel Rhodes' home on Tradd Street, only to find it likewise empty. Neighbors reported seeing Rhodes leaving shortly after midnight, carrying a lantern and what appeared to be a small traveling case. As the storm intensified, the search for Clara and Rhodes focused on Sullivan's Island, based on Clara's note. A small boat was reported missing from the city dock, and a fisherman claimed to have seen a craft, matching its description, heading toward the island, despite the worsening weather. By nightfall, the storm had become a full gale. The search party that had gone to Sullivan's Island was forced to take shelter in the abandoned quarantine hospital, ironically the very building they had come to search. It was there, by lantern light, that they discovered evidence that someone had been using the building's old records room. Papers were spread across a table, and a map of the island was pinned to the wall, with several locations marked in red ink. When the storm subsided the following morning, the search resumed. Footprints were discovered leading from the small dock on the island's western shore toward an area of marshland to the north of the quarantine building. The tracks eventually led to what appeared to be an old burial ground, unmarked on any official maps. Here, the ground had been recently disturbed. Someone had been digging. What they found in that freshly excavated pit would become the subject of hushed conversations and official denials for decades to come. According to the written statement of Captain Thomas Reynolds of the Charleston Watch, they discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 20 individuals. Based on the remnants of clothing and personal effects, these appeared to be the bodies of enslaved people. But what caused the search party's horror was not merely the discovery of the grave itself, but the condition of the remains. Dr. Joseph Johnson, who accompanied the search party as a medical examiner, refused to include certain details in his official report. However, in a private letter to a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, he wrote, "The condition of the remains suggests a medical procedure of the most grotesque and unconscionable nature was performed upon these unfortunate souls. Evidence indicates surgical interventions that go beyond any legitimate medical practice. I cannot help but conclude that these individuals were subjects of experimentation rather than victims of disease. Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont were never found. The small boat they presumably took to the island was discovered smashed against the rocks on the eastern shore. The official report concluded that they had likely perished in the storm while attempting to leave the island. Dr. Beaumont fell into a deep melancholy following his daughter's disappearance. His medical practice languished, and he became increasingly reclusive. In a final letter to his brother-in-law in Philadelphia, dated November 1839, he wrote, "I fear Clara discovered something that was never meant to be known. The Harmony and its human cargo, the quarantine, the epidemic that followed, all connected by hands that still have power in this city. I have been advised, in terms that permit no misunderstanding, to cease my inquiries." 3 weeks after writing this letter, Dr. Beaumont was found dead in his study. The coroner ruled it a case of apoplexy, but rumors persisted that he had taken his own life. The records that Rhodes had been examining were quietly removed from public access. The harbourmaster's logs for 1822 were reported damaged by flooding. The minutes of the Medical Society for the same period were destroyed in what was described as an unfortunate accident during cleaning. The section of St. Philip's burial records that had so interested Rhodes was found to be missing entirely. For nearly a century, the events of that summer faded from public memory, becoming at most a vague local legend about a northern researcher and a doctor's daughter who vanished during a storm. But in 1962, during renovations to an old building on Meeting Street that had once housed the offices of the Harbour Commission, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a waterproof tin box containing a leather-bound journal. The journal was that of Nathaniel Rhodes. Its early pages detailed his research into the fate of a slave ship called the Harmony, which had arrived in Charleston Harbour in June 1822, carrying an unusual cargo. According to Rhodes's notes, the Harmony had been chartered not by a slave trader, but by a consortium of doctors from Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. The enslaved people aboard were not intended for sale, but for another purpose entirely. Rhodes had traced connections between the arrival of the Harmony, the establishment of a special quarantine on Sullivan's Island, and the yellow fever epidemic that swept Charleston later that summer. His notes suggested that the epidemic may have been not merely a natural disaster, but the result of what he termed medical procedures of an experimental nature performed upon unwilling subjects. More disturbing still were Rhodes' final entries, dated September 6, 1839. He wrote of having made contact with a man who claimed to have worked as an orderly at the quarantine hospital. This man, elderly and near death, had provided Rhodes with the location of the mass grave on Sullivan's Island, and had spoken of doctors who sought to understand the disease by introducing it to healthy bodies, measuring its progress, testing treatments that killed more surely than the fever itself. The final entry, written in a hurried hand, stated, "Miss Beaumont has made the connection through her father's records." Several of the physicians involved in the Harmony affair later rose to positions of great influence in Charleston. Their descendants now sit on the boards that govern this city. She is in grave danger for having discovered this. We leave tonight for Sullivan's Island to document the evidence before confronting the authorities in Columbia. The journal was quietly acquired by a private collector and was not made public until 1968. When it was donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by an anonymous benefactor. By then, most of the families implicated were either extinct or had left Charleston, their influence diminished by the passage of time and changing fortunes. Others point to corroborating evidence. The Harmony did indeed arrive in Charleston in 1822, just before the yellow fever outbreak. There was a quarantine facility on Sullivan's Island that operated with unusual secrecy that summer. and several prominent Charleston physicians did publish papers on yellow fever treatments in the years following, papers that hinted at detailed observations of the disease's progression that would have been difficult to document in the ordinary course of treatment. Historians who have studied Rhodes' journal remain divided on its authenticity and the veracity of its claims. Some suggest it is an elaborate hoax, perhaps created decades after the events it purports to describe. The mass grave itself has never been conclusively relocated. The landscape of Sullivan's Island has changed dramatically over the intervening years due to both natural erosion and human development. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1950s identified several potential sites, but permission for excavation was consistently denied by local authorities, citing concerns about disturbing historically significant ground. What became of Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont remains unknown. No bodies matching their descriptions were ever recovered from the shores of Sullivan's Island or the harbor. Some local legends suggest they successfully fled Charleston, but died elsewhere under assumed names. Others propose a more sinister fate, that they were intercepted before they could bring their discoveries to light, their bodies disposed of where they would never be found. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how effectively it was erased from official records. The deliberate removal of documents, the strategic accidents that destroyed evidence, the pressure applied to silence those who knew too much, all speak to an organized effort to conceal whatever actually happened in Charleston during that fateful summer of 1822. In 1969, a graduate student researching the history of medical ethics in the American South claimed to have discovered a letter in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, written by a physician who had practiced in Charleston in the 1820s. The letter, dated 1841, contained a cryptic reference to the Sullivan Island procedure and expressed relief that those who sought to expose our necessary work have been consigned to the same silence as the subjects themselves. The student reported his finding to his faculty advisor, but when they returned to the archives to examine the letter more closely, it was no longer in the file where he had found it. Today, the old quarantine hospital on Sullivan's Island is long gone, replaced by beachfront homes and tourist amenities. The waters that separate the island from Charleston proper are crossed daily by pleasure craft and commuter ferries. Few of those who make the journey are aware of the dark chapter in the island's history, or of the two people who disappeared trying to bring it to light. Occasionally, after strong storms reshape the shoreline, unusual objects are found in the sand. Bone buttons, glass vials, fragments of medical implements from another era. Local authorities typically attribute these finds to shipwrecks or the gradual erosion of old dumping grounds. They discourage further investigation. And sometimes, rarely, usually in the hours before dawn, when the tide is at its lowest ebb, lights are reported moving across the marshes on the northern side of the island, as if someone carrying a lantern is still searching for something buried there long ago. Park rangers and local police have investigated these reports multiple times over the years, but have never found anyone in the area. The last known photograph of the unmarked burial ground, taken in 1953 before the area was redeveloped, shows a desolate patch of land, partially submerged at high tide, with a single weathered wooden post marking what might have been an entrance. The photograph resides in the collection of the Charleston Historical Society, incorrectly labeled as Abandoned Dock, Sullivan's Island, circa 1950. As for the records of the ship Harmony, the harbour logs that documented its arrival, the manifest of its human cargo, and the medical notes that may have detailed what happened to those aboard, these remain lost to history. Perhaps they still exist, hidden away in some private collection or buried in misfiled archives. Or perhaps they were destroyed long ago by those determined to ensure that some secrets remain buried, like bodies in unmarked graves, that slowly sink into the marshlands, becoming one with the dark waters that surround Sullivan's Island. The truth about what Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont discovered in 1839 may never be fully known. But in the quiet corners of Charleston's historic district, in the old homes where generations of the city's elite have lived and died, their names are still occasionally whispered with a mixture of fear and regret. Not as romantic figures who perished in a storm, but as people who came too close to uncovering a truth that some believed was better left hidden beneath the genteel surface of Charleston society. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls in from the harbor, shrouding the old city in mist, residents of Trad Street report hearing footsteps on the cobblestones outside, footsteps that stop before the house where Nathaniel Rhodes once lived, as if someone has returned, still searching for answers, still hoping to bring light to one of the darkest chapters in Charleston's long and troubled history. In 1965, a retired history professor named Dr. Margaret Holbrook began researching the Rhodes-Beaumont disappearance. Her interest was piqued after reading Rhodes' journal at the South Carolina Historical Society. Dr. Holbrook spent nearly 3 years tracking down descendants of families mentioned in Rhodes' notes, searching for private papers that might have escaped the systematic removal of official records. Her most significant discovery came from the attic of a summer home in Aiken, where the great-granddaughter of Dr. James Moultrie had preserved a collection of her ancestors' personal correspondence. Among these letters was one dated October 1839, addressed to a colleague in London. In it, Dr. Moultrie expressed deep unease about the Beaumont girls' discoveries and the subsequent disappearance of both her and Rhodes. "I fear that what transpired on Sullivan's Island in 22 has claimed yet more victims," Moultrie wrote. "The experiment was ill-conceived from its inception, born of scientific arrogance and a disregard for the humanity of those deemed lesser. That we sought to understand the fever's mechanism by deliberate infection was itself unconscionable. That we selected subjects based on their status as property rather than persons compounds the moral failure. And now, to silence those who would expose this dark chapter, I cannot reconcile this with the oath I took as a physician." The letter suggested that Moultrie himself had not been directly involved in the original experiments, but had learned of them later through professional connections. His distress seemed genuine, yet he had apparently never spoken publicly about what he knew, perhaps out of fear or a misguided sense of professional loyalty. Dr. E. Holbrook's research also led her to property records showing that 3 of the physicians implicated in Rhodes' journal had purchased adjacent plots of land on Sullivan's Island in early 1822, just months before the Harmony's arrival. These properties included the area where the quarantine facility was later established. More tellingly, all 3 properties were sold within 2 years of the yellow fever epidemic, and all 3 doctors relocated from Charleston shortly thereafter, one to Europe, one to New Orleans, and one to the newly established Medical College of Georgia. In the spring of 1967, Dr. Holbrook applied for permission to conduct archaeological investigations at the suspected site of the mass grave on Sullivan's Island. Her application included copies of historical maps, excerpts from Rhodes's journal, and supporting documentation from her research. The Charleston Historical Commission delayed their decision for several months before ultimately denying the request, citing concerns about private property rights and the potential disruption of historically significant terrain. Frustrated but undeterred, Dr. Holbrook decided to approach the investigation from another angle. If she couldn't examine the physical evidence of the grave, perhaps she could find more documentary evidence about the Harmony itself. She traveled to Liverpool, England, where the ship had reportedly been registered, to search the maritime records there. What she discovered in the Liverpool archives was unexpected. According to the official registry, the Harmony had indeed sailed for Charleston in 1822. However, the ship's stated purpose was to transport medical supplies and personnel to assist with fever outbreaks in the southern colonies. The ship's owner was listed not as an individual or a trading company, but as the Atlantic Medical Research Society, an organization about which the archives contain no other information. Even more curious was the record of the Harmony's return voyage. The ship did leave Charleston in September 1822, bound for Liverpool, but it never arrived at its destination. Maritime insurance records indicated that the Harmony was presumed lost at sea, with all hands and cargo. Dr. Holbrook's notes, found among her papers after her death, speculated that the loss of the Harmony may not have been accidental. If the ship carried not only human cargo on its outbound journey, she wrote, but also detailed records of the experiments conducted at the quarantine facility, its disappearance would have been convenient for those wishing to erase all evidence of what transpired. By 1968, Dr. Holbrook's health was failing, but she made one final effort to uncover the truth. She placed advertisements in newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, seeking information about Nathaniel Rhodes or Clara Beaumont from anyone who might have family connections or historical knowledge. Most of the responses were dead ends, amateur historians and curiosity seekers with nothing substantial to contribute. But one letter, postmarked from a small town in Maine, caught her attention. The writer, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Harding, claimed to be the great-niece of Clara Beaumont through Clara's maternal line. According to Ms. Harding's letter, her grandmother had always maintained that her Aunt Clara had not died on Sullivan's Island, but had escaped Charleston with Nathaniel Rhodes. They had fled north, she claimed, assuming new identities and settling in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine. They had lived quiet, reclusive lives, never returning to the South and never publishing their findings. Ms. Harding enclosed what she described as the only surviving photograph of the couple, supposedly taken in 1862 on the occasion of their 20th wedding anniversary. The photograph showed an austere middle-aged couple standing in front of a modest coastal home. The man's face was partially obscured by a beard, while the woman wore her hair pulled back severely from a face marked by hard years. Dr. Holbrook was initially skeptical of Ms. Harding's claims. The story seemed too convenient, too much like the happy ending one might wish for Rhodes and Beaumont, rather than the grim fate most historical evidence suggested. However, she arranged to visit Ms. Harding in Maine to examine any additional evidence the woman might have. Sadly, Dr. Holbrook never made this journey. She suffered a stroke in December 1968 and died 3 weeks later. Her research notes, correspondence, and the letter from Elizabeth Harding were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by her niece, but remained uncatalogued for several years. When a new archivist finally processed Dr. Holbrook's papers in 1974, the letter from Elizabeth Harding was missing, as was the photograph it had allegedly contained. A note in the file, written by the previous archivist, stated simply, "Items removed by request of the Charleston Historical Commission for review, never returned." The most tantalizing piece of evidence to emerge in recent decades came not from formal historical research, but from an unexpected source. In 1982, during renovation of an old sea captain's house in Rockport, Maine, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath a window seat on the second floor. Inside was a small tin box containing a journal, a locket containing 2 locks of hair, one dark, one fair, and a hand-drawn map of Sullivan's Island with several locations marked with small crosses. The journal was water-damaged and largely illegible, but several pages remained readable. The handwriting appeared to match surviving examples of Clara Beaumont's script from letters in her father's papers. One passage, dated April 1843, read, N. believes we are still at risk even after all these years. He starts at every unexpected sound, watches every stranger who comes to the village with suspicion. Perhaps he is right to do so. What we uncovered in Charleston was not merely a crime, but a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of society and medicine. Those responsible would still have much to lose should the truth become known. And so we maintain our silence, our false names, our fabricated past. Sometimes I wonder if this half-life, this perpetual hiding, is truly preferable to whatever fate might have awaited us had we stayed to bring the truth to light. Another fragment, apparently from a later entry, continued the theme. The temptation to send my findings to medical journals grows stronger as I age. The experiments conducted on those 23 souls, their systematic infection, the detailed documentation of their suffering, the variations in treatment that were never intended to cure but merely to observe different paths to death, these constitute one of the most profound violations of medical ethics in our nation's history. That this was done specifically to people purchased for this purpose, with no regard for their humanity, compounds the horror. Yet N. reminds me that those who orchestrated this atrocity went on to illustrious careers, trained generations of new physicians, and established medical institutions that still stand today. Their names are carved in marble on hospital facades. Who would believe our account against the weight of their legacies? The current owner of the house in Rockport, upon discovering these items, contacted a local historical society. The society's director recognized the potential significance of the find and reached out to colleagues at the University of Maine's History Department. A preliminary analysis of the journal suggested its authenticity as a 19th-century document, but further research was needed to verify the identity of its author and the veracity of its contents. Before this research could proceed, however, the tin box and its contents were stolen from the Historical Society's office during a break-in. Local police investigated but found no leads. The case was eventually classified as an ordinary theft, despite the fact that nothing else of obvious value was taken. For those few who have studied the Rhodes-Beaumont case in depth, these scattered fragments of evidence point to a disturbing conclusion: that respected physicians, operating under the guise of scientific research, conducted fatal experiments on enslaved people during the 1822 yellow fever epidemic. That these experiments were covered up through the deliberate destruction of records and possibly murder, and that the conspiracy of silence surrounding these events has persisted into the modern era. Yet without the mass grave, without the complete journals of either Rhodes or Beaumont, without the records of the Harmony or the quarantine facility, the full truth remains elusive. The story survives primarily as a footnote in academic papers on medical ethics or the history of yellow fever, acknowledged as a possibility but not established as historical fact. In 2001, a marine archaeology team, surveying the seabed off the coast of Sullivan's Island, discovered the remains of what appeared to be a small 19th-century boat. Initial excitement that this might be the missing craft used by Rhodes and Beaumont was tempered when further examination revealed that the boat had been deliberately scuttled. Holes had been drilled in its hull before it sank. No human remains were found in or near the wreck. The most recent development in the case came in 2008, when a construction project on Sullivan's Island was temporarily halted after workers uncovered what appeared to be human remains. Archaeological experts from the University of South Carolina were called in to examine the site. Their preliminary report identified the remains as dating from the early 19th century and noted that they appeared to be of African origin. More significantly, several of the bones showed evidence of surgical procedures performed before death, Before a full excavation could be completed, however, the construction company obtained a court order allowing them to resume work, with the stipulation that any additional remains discovered would be respectfully reinterred in a designated cemetery. The archaeological team was given 48 hours to complete their examination and remove any artifacts of historical significance. This abbreviated investigation yielded little additional information, and the site has since been developed into luxury condominiums. Today, the story of Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont exists in a liminal space between established history and legend. Walking tours of historic Charleston occasionally mention them as part of the city's ghost lore. The house on Trad Street, where Rhodes once lived, has been renovated multiple times and currently serves as an upscale vacation rental, marketed with no mention of its former occupant or his fate. Yet for those who know what to look for, traces of the story remain. In the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, Rhodes' journal sits in acid-free storage, its pages yellowed but its accusations still legible. In the old graveyard at St. Philip's Church, there is a section where the headstones are weathered beyond reading, the strangers section that so interested Rhodes in his research. And on Sullivan's Island at low tide, the marshlands sometimes reveal glints of glass or metal, perhaps remnants of medical implements, perhaps merely modern debris. The case of the Harmony and the Sullivan Island experiments represents one of the darkest intersections of medical history and the institution of slavery, a chapter so disturbing that it has been systematically erased from official records. That we know anything at all about it is largely due to the efforts of Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont, whose quest for truth may have cost them their lives. In her final notes, Dr. Margaret Holbrook wrote, "History is not merely what happened, but what we allow ourselves to remember. The systematic amnesia surrounding the Rhodes-Beaumont case speaks to more than just the protection of reputations. It reveals our national unwillingness to confront the most disturbing aspects of our medical and racial history. Until we are ready to acknowledge such chapters honestly, we remain vulnerable to repeating them in new forms." The marshlands of Sullivan's Island continue to shift with each tide and storm, alternately concealing and revealing their secrets. What other evidence might lie buried there, slowly sinking deeper into the mud with each passing year? What other documents might be hidden in attics, misfiled in archives, or sealed in university collections, awaiting discovery by someone willing to piece together this dark puzzle? And what of Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont themselves? Did they truly perish in the storm of September 7th, 1839? Were they silenced by those who wished to protect a terrible secret? Or did they escape to Maine, living out their days in anonymity, carrying the burden of what they knew but could not safely reveal? Perhaps someday the full truth will emerge. Until then, their story remains a whispered caution about the price of knowledge and the lengths to which power will go to protect itself from accountability. Like so many uncomfortable truths in American history, it lies just beneath the surface of the official narrative, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to uncover it. On certain nights, when the fog rolls in from Charleston harbor and shrouds Sullivan's Island in mist, locals sometimes report seeing two figures walking along the northern shore, one carrying what appears to be a lantern, the other clutching what might be a journal or portfolio. They move with purpose toward the marshlands, as if still searching for evidence, still seeking justice for those who lie in unmarked graves, still hoping to bring to light what has so long remained in darkness. Those who have glimpsed these figures say they vanish when approached, leaving behind only footprints that the incoming tide quickly erases. Just as time and tide have nearly erased the story of Nathaniel Rhodes and Clara Beaumont, two people who dared to ask questions about one of the most disturbing medical experiments in American history, and who may have paid the ultimate price for their curiosity.